Alright friends, welcome back to History with Tim. Today we're going to be reviewing a new series. Now I mentioned the series before when we were discussing our American Civil War movies and series. I had only seen clips. I plan to actually do a few of these because there have been quite a few very good historical series that have come out. I also just finished watching Franklin on Apple Plus. But today we're going to be discussing the TV series Manhunt. So what Manhunt is Manhunt is a movie about the attempted, well, not the attempted, it's about the assassination attempt on Abraham Lincoln. Well, the success, sorry, attempt's kind of a bad way to put it, is about the assassination of President Lincoln and the attempted assassination of Secretary of State William Seward and Vice President Andrew Johnson. Now, the series stars someone I'm actually a huge fan of, Tobias Menzies. You guys might know him from Outlander, The Crown. He plays Prince Philip. Game of Thrones, he plays Edmure Tully, and then he plays Brutus in HBO's Rome. Very, very great actor. He's also in The Terror, which is a great AMC series. I actually think it's BBC. But he's amazing. Amazing actor. I only have one comment on them choosing him as Stanton. That's what Edwin Stanton actually looked like, and that's what Tobias Menzies looks like in the series. There's one thing about this series. It definitely plays on the fact that Stanton was a lawyer. He was a lawyer. In fact, one of his most famous cases is he was the one that actually got Dan Sickles off with temporary insanity. He was Dan Sickles, the general from Gettysburg. He was his lawyer in the trial where Sickles murdered Francis Scott Key's son, Philip Scott Key. So Stanton was actually a portly man. He obviously had facial hair, very bad eyesight, which they do play on the bad eyesight. He also did suffer from asthma, though, which is something they do show in the series. Regardless, I think he did a great job playing him. He did a really fantastic job. And now we're going to get on to our second star. So the series follows Stanton, because I'm just going to start by telling you this. Before the Civil War and in the immediate era after the Civil War, there was no Department of Justice. Yes, there was an Attorney General of the United States who reviewed laws, and he would be sort of like a Solicitor General in a way, but there was no actual Department of Justice. The Department of Justice wouldn't come into existence until the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, when he created them to fight the Ku Klux Klan. So a really cool thing they do in this series is they actually show how the military, using people like Lafayette Barnes and Stanton himself and Thomas Eckert of the War Department, how they actually kind of had to serve as a prerequisite to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was the military that actually carried out the investigations about Booth, Surratt, Powell, Atzerodt, all these guys, and David Harold, who was with John Wilkes Booth, and also Samuel Mudd, who we'll get into it as we get to it. But we're going to go to the next star of this film, this series, and that is going to be Anthony Boyle. Now, Anthony Boyle plays John Wilkes Booth. Anthony Boyle got his start. He's an Irish actor. He, I believe he originated the role of Scorpius Malfoy. I think that's his name. All you Harry Potter fans, yell at me if I'm wrong. Scorpius. It's Scorpius, that's right. Scorpius Malfoy in The Cursed Child production in Ireland or England, I believe. Probably the West End, actually. He also plays Daniel in Derry Girls, which is actually where I first saw him, ironically. And then he also is in Masters of the Air. He actually, in comparison to Tobias Menzies, he actually looks a lot like Booth. They did a very good job. Booth something I think a lot of people forget about John Wilkes Booth at the time of the assassination. I don't like to give out information about myself, but I'm coming up to 30. I'm an older person. I'm not older, but I'm on my older side, my 20s. Booth was a few days from his 26th birthday. That's right. He was only in his mid 20s when he did this. He was a kid. We look at the picture of him there and we go, oh well, that's a man. That's a grown man. By today's standards, that's a kid. He's a kid, and the fact that he was able to help orchestrate this horrible, destructive thing that happened to our government is amazing. But now, we're going to get into the subject of what brought us to this. So we're going to start here on April 9th, 1865. This is at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, in the McLean Parlor. General Robert E. Lee, commander of the Army of Northern Virginia and commanding all Confederate forces, surrenders officially to General Ulysses S. Grant in command of all Union forces, as well as Generals Sheridan and a few others. Fun fact, George Meade was actually not at Appomattox Courthouse. He was too busy commanding the Army of the Potomac on the march. Sheridan, I believe Custer was there at the end. Men like that, they were there, and it's at this famous meeting, Eli Parker, I believe his name is, that he was a Native American general on Grant's staff. Lee said, I'm very happy to see that at least there's one real American here today. And Parker looked at Lee and said, we're all real Americans, sir. And after that, Lee signed the surrender. So this is where we're going to start. We're going to start at April 9th, 1865. At this point, Richmond has already fallen. Richmond is already under Northern control. Jefferson Davis is now a fugitive. It's very strongly believed at this point that Lincoln kind of was of the opinion of letting these people go. He didn't want Reconstruction to be painful. He famously paroled the entire Confederate Army. Now think about that. He paroled an entire rebel army. It was very noble what he did. He paroled the generals, people like Lee. Lee, whose home became Arlington National Cemetery. The White House is fun. It's funny because I was at the White House a few weeks ago. You can see Arlington House from the White House. So Arlington House, that was Lee's home. So he paroled Lee, he paroled Longstreet, he paroled all these guys, even some of these monsters like Nathaniel Bedford Forrest and Joe Wheeler, these guys who made infamy in the Atlanta campaign. He paroled them because his mentality was, we won the war. Before the war had ended, the House of Representatives had already approved the 13th Amendment. He's like, we've won the war, now we need to win the peace. And he knew that had they publicly whipped or publicly executed these members of the Confederate government and Confederate armed forces, the South would not rest. They would be furious. The men would keep fighting, and it would pretty much turn into like a Vietnam kind of situation. You'd have Union armies in the South getting ambushed by Confederate insurgencies. So this is where our story begins. April 9th, 1865. So Lincoln and Stanton received the news from Grant that the Confederate Army has agreed to surrender. Now, a very important distinction here is this was only one army. Yes, Lee was in command of all the Confederate armies at this point in the war, but he only surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia. The issue with that is during the meeting, Grant said to him, he's like, reach out to your other armies and tell them to stand down. The war is over. And Lee said, I need to consult my president first. And Grant, at this point, if you're going to give Grant anything, Grant was a very witty guy. Grant at this point says, there is only one president, sir. So you had Joe Johnson, which you guys love Joe Johnson. I got to say, I do plan to do a new video on Joe Johnson, just for those of you that love him, and a new Longstreet and a few other guys. But Joe Johnson's army was still on the move in the Carolinas. You had armies in the West that were still fighting. We talk about Juneteenth a lot. Juneteenth, they say that's the day the Emancipation Proclamation made it to Galveston. That's not exactly true. What really it was the 13th Amendment made it to Galveston, because the Emancipation Proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation, all it did, it was a war power that said anyone in slavery in states in rebellion were free. When those Union troops got to Galveston, Texas was no longer in rebellion. So technically, they weren't free. It was with the passage of the 13th Amendment that they became free. But it's with this, the war's over, in the East, at least. Because a few days later, Johnson would surrender when he found out Lee had surrendered. And the war on the East Coast was done. It was over. Because obviously, in the West, it continued until June. But so now, we're going to go to the Knights of the Golden Circle. The Knights of the Golden Circle were a component of the Confederate Secret Service. Now, I say Confederate Secret Service, you're probably thinking, oh, Jefferson Davis had Secret Service? No. Confederate Secret Service was more of their espionage units. We had Secret Service units too, very similar to them. But the Confederate Secret Service were in contact with people like John Wilkes Booth, John Surratt, Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt. These gentlemen, a lot of businessmen in the North as well. They were in contact with them, and originally the plan that Booth and the Knights of the Golden Circle had planned was to kidnap Lincoln. Now, the reason they wanted to kidnap him was because the plan was to ransom him for Confederate prisoners of war, because Grant had stopped the prisoner exchanges. But at this point, the war was over, and they just wanted revenge at this point. But also, it was a foolhardy thing to do, because, like we say, the war was over. Richmond had already fallen. Richmond was under federal occupation. Booth had this insane vision that he was a hero, that he was going to be this Romanesque hero that would be, lifted up by all the Confederate generals and celebrated as a hero to the Confederacy for what he did. But him and his conspirators at the Surratt boarding house in Washington, D.C., concocted a plan. The plan was simple. They were going to decapitate the federal government of the United States of America. So the plan was Lewis Powell, that's our gentleman here on the bottom left, he would assassinate Secretary of State William Seward. Now, why kill the Secretary of State? We look at people like Anthony Blinken, Mike Pompeo, today, even Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice. What do we get out of assassinating them? Hillary Clinton, I believe John Kerry was her successor, I believe. What does that mean to take out the Secretary of State? Because, Bush had 2 Secretaries of State. Trump had 2 Secretaries of State. President Biden actually has only had 1 Secretary of State, so that's kind of impressive, considering President Obama obviously had 2 Secretaries of State. So, but back then, the Secretary of State was actually kind of more important than the Vice President. There was actually no clear succession for the presidency at this time in history. So no one really knew what happened if a president were to be assassinated. Usually, you just assume the vice president succeeds. That is the assumption, but we run to a roadblock here. So let me finish who the targets were, though. So William Seward, Secretary of State, was going to be killed by Lewis Powell. President Lincoln will be assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, and Andrew Johnson will be assassinated by George Atzerodt, a German immigrant recently to the country who sided with the Confederate cause. Now, I said before, usually the vice president succeeds. True. Andrew Johnson was from the South. He was a Southerner. He was a Southern Democrat who sided with the North. This made him very unpopular in the South. But it also made him unpopular in the North, because the Northern Democrats didn't like him because he was a Southerner, and the Southern Democrats didn't like him because he sided with the North. So you have this character here that the reason Lincoln picked him as his vice president was because Lincoln actually, for his second term, didn't run in the Republican Party, so to speak. He ran something that became known as the Unity Party. So it was a Republican president, a Democrat vice president, and it would be seen as a symbol of uniting the country. So, well, we know what happens next. April 14th at about 10:15 p.m., 1865, John Wilkes Booth sneaks into the opera box of the Ford's Theater and shoots President Lincoln in the back of the head, stabs Major Rathbone, jumps from the booth, declares Sic Semper Tyrannis, in Latin, that is, thus always to tyrants, and then flees the theater. Now, while this is happening, George Atzerodt is at, I believe, the Liberty Hotel, where Vice President Andrew Johnson is. Vice President Andrew Johnson is celebrating the end of the war with other dignitaries, officers, soldiers, so on. Atzerodt chickens out, and he gets drunk and he leaves. However, at the same time, Lewis Powell, or Lewis Payne, whatever he went by, he did have pseudonyms. He will go to the home of William Seward, who had just had surgery after being in a carriage accident. He will break in, he will attack Seward's servants and son, and he will stab the Secretary of State, and then flee. Unfortunately for him, he did not kill the Secretary of State. He actually missed every vital organ and vital artery while stabbing him because of the brace Seward was wearing. So unfortunately, the only person killed at this time is President Lincoln, and President Lincoln actually will not die until early on the 15th. So now what happens after this is Secretary of War Edwin Stanton knows that there's only one way Booth is going to flee. Booth is going to flee to the south. So he makes a reward for Booth, $100,000, $50,000, $25,000, $25,000 for John Surratt, John Wilkes Booth, and David Harold. John Surratt, it's very unknown what actually was going on with John Surratt at this time. A lot of people think he became disenfranchised with the Confederacy and he fled the country because when they did find him, he was actually in Rome serving the papal zouaves. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln also did not help Catholics in America because the Surratts were a Catholic family, and Mary Surratt, John Surratt's mother, who would be tried and executed. She's the first female to be tried by a tribunal and executed by a military court, and the last because they made it illegal to do that again. But she will be seen as kind of the nest of the conspiracy, and it made a very bad image for other Catholics in the country, many of whom were Irish in the north and Italians. But so Booth and Harold flee together. They get across the Navy Yard Bridge, pretty much using his place as a actor to get into Virginia. But something had happened when Booth jumped from the booth. I get it. He had broken his ankle. And because of that, he needed to have it mended. And in Virginia, he knew of a guy who would help him, a man named Dr. Samuel Mudd. Now, Samuel Mudd is an interesting character because there's ideas that he was attached to the Confederate Secret Service. There's other ideas that he just was a doctor following his Hippocratic Oath. The show, it shows the former. I kind of lean towards the latter, but also I kind of lean towards the man was living in Northern Virginia and had slaves, so he probably, finding out what Booth did, would be happy regardless because he was angry about how the war went and how Virginia got affected. Because Virginia was the battleground for the Eastern Theater, so the Virginians definitely had a chip on their shoulder about the war. But Samuel Mudd will mend Booth's leg, and then he'll send him on his way. Now, this whole time, there's a manhunt happening for Booth. They're hunting him down, they're looking for him, they don't know where to find him, and they're looking for leads. You know, Confederate soldiers are coming forth because Confederate soldiers consider what he did dishonorable. They think he was a coward for shooting a man in the back, which, you know, kind of went against this whole romanticism he had built for himself, that he was going to be the savior of the Confederacy, this insane ploy he had made up for himself. But so Dr. Mudd helps him, and they leave. They catch up with Booth in a barn in Virginia. They light it on fire to get him out, and then Sergeant Boston Corbett shoots Booth in the back. It's not really known why or how he got shot, but this will happen on April 26th. So, if you really look at this, this is almost 10 days apart. They got him 10 days after he had killed Lincoln. So, the country mourns everything, and Reconstruction probably goes worse than it had to because of Lincoln dying, because you had Andrew Johnson step into office, and Andrew Johnson was too busy trying to placate everyone, including the businesses. Now, something a lot of people forget, and this show actually touches on it, the northern businesses were very against the war, as strange as it is to say, because a lot of their raw materials came from the South. So they were very opposed to it, and that's going to lead us down this road of all these theories and everything that people think happened. But with that, let's start. So the first episode just goes by the pilot. So this episode starts, it's interesting because it shows Lincoln and Booth. I mean, it shows Booth, and a cool thing it does is, a lot of people don't realize this about John Wilkes Booth, he, here on his hand, actually had a JWB tattooed. So that was also a way they were able to identify him when they did shoot him. But it starts at April 9th with the surrender of Lee and Stanton and Lincoln celebrating. But at the same time, it's going through the motions. You see John Wilkes Booth visiting Ford's Theater. The reason Booth visits Ford's Theater is because Booth actually had a box. He had made his mail sent there because he would stay at a hotel in D.C. and he would get his mail sent to Ford's Theater. And he was there picking it up, and he found out that Lincoln was going to be in attendance that night to see Our American Cousin. Booth knew Our American Cousin. He knew every line in the show. So he's like, well, I know when is a good time to do it. So he leaves, and then we get to the scene, which I don't think this actually happened. Stanton, I'm not saying Lincoln and Stanton did not have a close relationship. The two men were very close. They were friends. You know, they actually hated each other at first. Stanton, before politics, often referred to Lincoln as a baboon. He thought he was a monkey. He looked like a monkey. He thought he was an idiot. He thought he was folksy. And even during the war, Lincoln used to do things that really got Stanton upset. He didn't like how he pardoned guys. He didn't like, you know, think about this era. There's no such thing as shell shock. There's no such thing as this. You're a coward if you don't fight. So he would pardon all these people, and Stanton would get mad because it's like, what are you, like, how are we supposed to keep a standard? But it's also cool because they show something, he often referred to Stanton as Mars. Now, for those of you that don't know Greek mythology, Roman mythology, Mars is the Roman equivalent of Ares. He's the Roman god of war. So that's why he referred to him as Mars. The Secretary of the Navy he referred to as Neptune, I believe. So you see this interaction with him, and it is a friendly interaction, you know. It shows the reaction at the end of the war. They were both very happy that the war was over. I do not believe Stanton was not. I'm not even going to say I don't believe. I know Stanton was not invited to Ford's Theater. Stanton was actually supposed to be at another party, an officers' club party that night. He was actually in the War Department, though. He was Reconstruction was a military operation. The United States Army was in charge of Reconstruction, so he was the point man on that. And Lincoln, and they explain that in the show, how he is the point man of this. So you see this interaction with the two of them, and then we see Booth pretty much prepping himself. We see them all getting ready. David Herold and Lewis Powell arrive to the Seward estate, and then we see the attempt on William Seward, and we see him push through the manservant. He charges upstairs. He attacks William Seward's son Francis, and he then stabs Seward. And then we see him walk out of the house looking all bloody. Herold had already fled though, because Herold thought and this was true too. This actually did happen. Herold thought he was making too much noise, so he got out of there, so it wasn't as suspicious. The next scene we see is Booth making his way up to the opera box, and I don't know why they didn't use Ford's Theater for this show, or even there's a reconstructed Ford's Theater in upstate New York. I don't know why those weren't used, because the theater they're in is very clearly not Ford's Theater, because Ford, what they make it look like is they make it look like he comes in and hides behind the curtain and locks the door, which in a way he did. The way the Ford's Theater opera box worked was there was a main door here, and then there was a side door here. This was the servant's door, and the main door was here. And what he did was he came in through the servant's door, because he went up back through the rafters. And he opened the side door after he had already barricaded the main door. And then he locked the side door so no one could get in. But then we also see him doing it. Now, I don't know how true it is that he did that. Again, we don't know what actually happened, because obviously everything we could have known died with Booth. And he did have a diary. No one knows what actually happened with the diary, and I'll explain that later in this review, because they actually kind of direct towards what one of the possible theories to have happened was. We see him mouthing the lines of the show, though. He comes forward, takes the gun, shoots Lincoln, he stabs Major Rathbone, and then he jumps, and we see his spur gets stuck on the flag, and he breaks his ankle. He screams "Sic Semper Tyrannis," he runs out, grabs the horse, rides away. Now, the next thing we see is him crossing the bridge, out, he uses his prominence as an actor, and then we're brought to Edwin Stanton arriving to Lincoln's, to the house, the Pearson house, across the street. It's very tense. You see Robert Kennedy. You see Robert. I don't know why I said Robert Kennedy. You see Robert Lincoln yelling at everyone. Mary Todd's freaking out. It was very on point to what probably was happening inside the house at that time. Mary Todd was yelling at Lincoln's bodyguard, who, it was true, he went next door to get a drink when the assassination took place. But again, this was not something that people thought could happen. No one thought, especially after the war was over, that anyone would do something like this. So, not saying that it was okay for him to walk away, but also you need to understand why no one thought him walking away would cause this. But so, the Peterson house, we have Stanton having to start making decisions, which, again, I like. They show Stanton really, following the assassination, took control of the government. Yes, Andrew Johnson was going to be the president now, but Stanton had to make sure the government survived. So, like in a movie like Valkyrie, the whole point of Operation Valkyrie is to make sure the regime stays in charge. Stanton was kind of in that mindset too. I'm not comparing the two, the same thing, but this is what the first actions if a government is at the threat like this is, especially at such a fragile time. His thing was, shut the bridges down, do not let anyone out of the city, cut everything off, secure everything, make sure all armies are on high alert, and this was one of the most important moves he made. He said, bring Grant back to D.C. The Army, the commander of the United States Armed Forces, should be in the capital. So Grant was in Jersey at the time visiting his children. But now we go to Herold and Booth meeting up. Booth's being a little cocky, like, oh, I did it. And then we get to 7/22 on the 15th. This is when Abraham Lincoln dies. Finally. After suffering all night. Which, again, he probably wasn't suffering because being shot where he was shot, he was knocked unconscious immediately. What they were doing was they were actually putting their finger into his skull to relieve the clot because they thought it could help him. But it's probably around 4 o'clock in the morning they realized that's not going to stop anything and that the president will be dead. Now, there's two versions of what Stanton said. There's, now he belongs to the angels. So, like, in the movie Lincoln with Daniel Day-Lewis, we see Stanton say that. He says, well, now he belongs to the angels. In this, Tobias Menzies says the other version, which is now he belongs to the ages. Which was, it was beautiful. It was a beautiful moment. It's always, it's a sad scene, but it's often impressive how they can recreate the scene. Almost everyone was there when Lincoln died. All the cabinet was there. The only person that wasn't there was Andrew Johnson, and that was because Stanton ordered him to stay somewhere safe. Because, again, this might have been a bigger conspiracy. There might have been sharpshooters or something hiding. This is really an important moment, but also you need to make sure the succession of power is safe. Next, we see Booth arriving at the Mudd farm. This is where we start getting into kind of this weird thing about what was known. Was Mudd actually in on it? Was he a member of the conspiracy? The show definitely takes liberties with that. A lot of this is lost to history. Mudd was a Confederate. He was in Virginia. He was loyal to the Confederacy. Was he in the Confederate Secret Service? We don't know. We don't. It's just the reality. And the fact that even the fixed tribunal that was held against Mudd said, we don't know. That says everything you need. Because at that tribunal, they were willing to sentence Jefferson Davis to execution. So that says everything you really need to know. Now, follow that, we see the actual funeral. Well, not the funeral, but we see the procession from the Peterson house back to the White House. It's very well done. I'm not sure. I like how they use U.S. colored troops a lot, but I'm not sure if they would have been that many in the city. The U.S. colored troops were deployed units. Those were deployed soldiers. So the fact that there were so many of them in this, not saying that they weren't there, but especially at like Lincoln's death, I don't think it would have been U.S. colored troops there. It probably was just regular infantry that was in the city at the time. And then the last thing we really of note we see during this episode is the searching of Booth's room at the National Hotel. That's the hotel he would stay in, as well as Stanton kind of taking on an investigator role. Now, I get why they're doing that, because like I said earlier, the Army did serve as kind of a prelude to the FBI. They were the ones doing the investigation, but Stanton was not doing on the groundwork. Stanton was a member of the U.S. cabinet. He was a Secretary of War. For reference to that, right now, our Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, would not be running around investigating. That's just not how it would. Flynn wouldn't have... Not Flynn. Who was... Esper. Esper wouldn't have done that. Mattis wouldn't have done that. Gates wouldn't have done that. That's just not something that happens. The Secretary of War's job is to conduct the War Department. So it's true that the military did turn into a police force. They were looking for evidence. They were arresting people. It's this time we see Atzerodt get arrested. We see Powell get arrested. We even see Mary Surratt get arrested. Which, again, Mary Surratt, I think there's more than enough evidence that she probably wasn't actually as involved as people like to make it out that she was. To be honest, she probably was guilty of not stopping it because it was happening in her home. But, you can't judge what a mother does to defend their child. They also make John Surratt, a little more active in the assassination, which, to be honest, I don't think there's really any evidence of that. But, because he fled the city a few weeks before the assassination, and the war wasn't even over. It wasn't even an assassination attempt when he left. It was still the kidnapping attempt. So, that brings episode 1 to an end. You know, we meet Lafayette Barnes. We meet one of his agents, who's also a double agent for the New York business class. You're going to see a lot of anti-business class in this show, which, you know, again, like I said, the business class was opposed to the war. They were against what Lincoln did. But this is going to have to be a part series because we are already at about 35 minutes, and I don't really want this to go too long. So we're going to stop there for today. We're going to get back into this on Monday with the rest of the series, hopefully. Thank you so much for joining me, friends. I really hope you enjoyed it. Please go watch it. It actually is such a good series. Like, I'm giving my critiques, I'm giving my points of view on it, but it is such a good series. You need to watch it. Please like, share, comment, and please subscribe. I see the analytics. I see that most of you aren't subscribed, but you keep coming back to watch. Please just subscribe. Join this ever-growing history community. And also, please donate to the American National Park Preservation Fund. That's something we here at History of Tim started in the hopes to help donate money to national battlefields, national forests, national aviaries, and such, just to make their job a little easier in these hard times, because a lot of the money allocated to those places are not being allocated anymore. They're being pulled to allocate other things. So thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.